I am transmitting this from a shielded ore shaft 300 meters below the surface of Kepler 9, and I want you to understand something before I say anything else. I am not a soldier. My name is Dio Amara. I map rock formations for a living. I measure mineral density and send reports to people who care about profit margins and nothing else. I have never fired a weapon in my life. I am 31 years old, and I have spent the last 4 years on this tiny outpost cataloging silicon deposits in a dead asteroid belt at the edge of humanity's reach. I am telling you this because what I saw today will only make sense if you understand what I am not. The Vreth fleet dropped out of hyperspace at 0614 hours, station time. I was eating a bowl of oats at a table near the viewport. There were 6 of us in the common room. Petra Holt was reading something on her tablet. Owen Grant was arguing with the coffee dispenser. Nicole was laughing at him. 3 others whose names I am writing down so that I will never forget them. Ellis Ward, Conrad Baines, and a young lab assistant named Faye Doyle, who had only been on Kepler 9 for 11 days. She had shown me photographs of her dog the evening before, a large brown animal named Rhubarb. One moment the sky beyond the viewport was empty and quiet and full of distant stars. The next moment there were ships, not 1 or 2, dozens, dark shapes, angular and enormous, sliding into formation like teeth closing in a jaw. They moved with a precision that made my stomach drop, because that kind of precision only comes from practice. These were not explorers. These were not traders. You do not move like that unless you have done it before to someone else. The outpost commander, a man named Colonel Arthur Finch, was on the communications channel within 90 seconds. I heard his voice through the common room speakers, steady and controlled in a way that told me he was working very hard to sound that way. All personnel, this is Finch. We have unidentified vessels in Sector 9. I need everyone at their assigned emergency stations. Do not panic. Do not transmit anything on open channels. Move. Owen Grant stopped arguing with the coffee machine. The common room went completely silent. I remember looking at Faye Doyle and seeing her set down her cup very carefully, like she was afraid of making noise. Even though the ships outside were still millions of kilometers away, we went to our stations. Mine was a supply room near the lower access tunnels, which tells you everything about how useful they considered geologists in a crisis. I sat on a crate and listened to the command channel, and I waited. The Vreth transmission came 40 minutes later. It was broadcast on every frequency simultaneously, in 47 languages, and the translation was almost insultingly smooth. They had clearly prepared it well in advance. The message said that the Kepler 9 sector had been designated a transit corridor under the authority of the Vreth Expansion Directive. All human personnel were given 12 hours to evacuate. Any facilities remaining after that period would be removed. The word they used was not destroyed. It was removed as if we were furniture. As if this outpost and the 212 people inside it were objects to be cleared away, so that something more important could use the space. Colonel Finch sent an emergency signal to Earth and to the Galactic Council simultaneously. Then he got back on the channel and told us to begin loading the 2 evacuation shuttles. I want to be clear about the timeline, because it matters. The Council's acknowledgement of our distress signal came in at the 2-hour mark. It was polite. It expressed concern. It said that a formal inquiry would be submitted to the Vreth governing body, and that all parties were encouraged to seek a peaceful resolution. It said this in the same tone you would use when telling a child that you have heard their complaint and you are looking into it. At hour 4, the Council transmitted a second message. This one was addressed specifically to humanity's representative, Dr. Mara Osi, who was currently aboard the Council station, some 40 light minutes away. The message advised her that the Vreth had sovereign expansion rights under the Galactic Charter, and that while the timing was regrettable, human facilities in unclaimed sectors were not protected under the same provisions as established territories. It suggested that humanity consider voluntary relocation. I heard Arthur Finch read that message aloud. I heard the silence that followed it. At hour 7, with 1 shuttle loaded and the second halfway through boarding, the Vreth opened fire. There was no second warning. There was no countdown. There was a sound like every metal surface in the station vibrating at once, a deep resonant hum that I felt in my teeth and my chest and the palms of my hands, and then the upper level of the station simply ceased to exist. The explosion was not what I expected. I had imagined a fireball, something cinematic. What I heard instead was a sound like the world inhaling sharply and then going very still. I was thrown against the wall of the supply room. I hit something with my shoulder, and then I was on the floor, and the lights were red, and the emergency channel was full of voices that were cut off, one by one until there was only static. I do not know how long I lay on the floor. When I got up, the air in the corridor was thick with particulate, and the pressure seals had blown on the upper access shaft. I moved downward on instinct. following the emergency lighting strips that still flickered along the base of the walls. The ore shaft access hatch was 40 meters below the common room. I pulled it open and I went inside and I sealed it behind me and I sat in the dark, inside a mountain of rock and carbon, and I breathed. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the shaking in my hands to slow, long enough to understand what I had to do next. The shaft had an emergency relay buried in the wall, a small unit designed to transmit geological survey data through deep rock to the surface receiver. Its range was limited, its signal was narrow, but it was still active because it ran on its own independent power cell, and nobody had thought to include it in the Vreth's targeting data. I pulled up the relay interface. My hands were steadier than I thought they would be. I did not think about the common room, or Fay Doyle, or Owen Grant and his argument with the coffee machine. I did not let myself. There would be time for that later, or there would not, but either way it would not help me right now. I composed the message in 37 words. I gave my name. I gave the station designation. I gave the time of the strike and a brief damage assessment, based on what I had heard and felt. And then I wrote the 4 words that I knew, with absolute certainty, that someone back home needed to hear above everything else. They fired first, unprovoked. I sensed it. Then I sat in the dark and I waited. And I thought about 212 people. And I thought about a brown dog named Rhubarb. And I did not cry because there was nobody there to see me, and so there was no point in being brave about it. But I did not cry anyway. I think I was too far past fear by then. I had passed through fear and come out the other side into something quieter and much more focused. 3 hours and 14 minutes later, a signal came back down through the rock and reached me in that narrow shaft. It was encoded with a military cipher that I had not known I had clearance for, but apparently someone back home had decided that today was the day to share that information. I decrypted it. I read it twice. It was not a message of comfort. It was not a promise of rescue. It was a set of coordinates, a timestamp 72 hours in the future, and a sequence of numbers that I recognized only because I had spent 4 years on a geological survey outpost where we used similar format for targeting mineral extraction charges. It was a strike package. Someone on Earth had received my 37 words, and they had not called for a meeting. They had not submitted a formal inquiry. They had done the thing that every civilized voice in the galaxy had spent 300 years assuming humanity would never, could never, would not dare to do. They had started planning. I pressed my back against the cold rock wall of that shaft, and I exhaled slowly. Outside, somewhere above me, the Vreth were moving through the wreckage of Kepler 9. They were probably already filing reports, cataloging the cleared space, notating the sector as open for transit use. They were probably doing it with the same calm efficiency with which they had arrived, because from their perspective, the matter was settled. A small obstacle had been removed. A Category 3 species had been reminded of its place. They did not know about my 37 words. They did not know about the signal that had come back to me through 300 meters of rock. They did not know that somewhere in the narrow darkness of a mining shaft, the last person alive on Kepler 9 was reading a strike package and already beginning to understand what came next. I closed the relay interface. I saved the coordinates. I checked the power cell on my emergency suit, because if anyone was coming for me in 72 hours, I needed to still be breathing when they arrived. I settled in to wait, and for the first time since the station went silent, something that was not grief moved through me. Something older and quieter and considerably more patient than anything the Vreth had put in their calculations. They had fired first. They had fired first, and they had not finished the job. In all the history of every species that humanity had ever studied, across every conflict and every record and every archive we had ever accessed, that was the single most consistent mistake a stronger force could make against a human one. You do not strike us and walk away. You do not take something from us and then turn your back. We remember every name. We count every loss. And we work quietly and without announcement, for exactly as long as it takes. The ore shaft hummed with the warmth of the relay unit's power cell. Outside was silence and wreckage, and the Vreth, already forgetting we were here. I had 72 hours. I started making notes. The Vreth Admiral's name, as I came to learn over the weeks that followed, was Vreth Kalen. In the official Galactic Council records, he was listed as a strategic expansion, Commander Class 1, with 43 successful territorial acquisitions across 6-star systems. His record was noted in the files as exemplary. The council members spoke of him the way you speak of a force of nature, with a kind of reluctant admiration that is really just another word for acceptance. In the briefing room aboard the extraction shuttle that pulled me out of the Kepler 9 shaft at hour 71, Lieutenant Colonel Grace Okafor spread his profile across the holographic table and looked at me with steady brown eyes and said, "Tell me exactly what you saw." I told her everything, every detail I had recorded in my notes. the formation the ships took when they dropped into the sector, the interval between the final transmission and the strike, the direction of the first impact based on the pressure differential I had felt in the walls. I am a geologist. I notice things about structure and force and the behavior of solid matter under stress. The Vreth had dropped a shaped charge on the station's upper superstructure, which told me the goal had been to disable communications first, and then collapse the pressurized living sections. It was efficient. It was practiced. They had done it before. Grace Okafor listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she nodded once and said, "Good, come with me." The extraction shuttle brought me to a vessel I had no name for. A long dark ship with no registry markings and an internal layout that did not match any civilian or commercial design I had ever seen. I was given a meal, a change of clothes, and a medical scan, and then I was taken to a room where 5 people sat around a table and looked at me as though I was something they had been waiting for. One of those people was Dr. Mara Osi. I recognized her from the news feeds. In person she was smaller than she appeared on screen, but somehow more present. The way certain people fill a room not with volume, but with the quality of their attention. She looked at me for a moment before she spoke, and I had the distinct sense that she was deciding how much of the truth I could handle. She apparently decided on all of it. The Council has formally requested that Earth submit to a temporary withdrawal from all outer ring sectors, pending review of the Vreth expansion petition, she said. They have framed this as a humanitarian measure to prevent further incidents. Meaning they want us to leave, I said. Meaning they expect us to leave, she said. There is a difference. She slid a file across the table to me. I opened it. Inside was a document, dense with legal language, that the Council had drafted within 18 hours of the Kepler-9 strike. It was a formal recognition of the Vreth's territorial claim. It referred to the attack on the outpost as an enforcement action. It referred to the 212 people who died as collateral casualties of an administrative oversight. Those words sat in the room with all of us, and nobody spoke for a moment. Then a man at the far end of the table, who had not introduced himself and whose uniform had no insignia, said, "They wrote that before the bodies were cold." "They wrote that," Dr. Osai said carefully, "because they believed it was already over." I looked at the file. I thought about the strike package I had received in that shaft. I looked up. "Is it?" I asked. Dr. Osai smiled. It was a small, quiet thing, but it reached her eyes. "No," she said, "it is not." What followed was the most astonishing 2 hours of my life up to that point. And my life had just included surviving an orbital strike from inside a hole in a rock. So the bar was already considerably high. They showed me what humanity had been building. Not what the public knew about. Not the small fleet of diplomatic escort vessels, and the scientific research ships, and the handful of defensive satellites around Earth and Mars that, the Galactic Council had been told, represented the full extent of humanity's military capability. Not those. The other thing. The thing that had been constructed piece by piece over 60 years of quiet, patient, extraordinarily careful work, while humanity smiled politely at the Council, and attended the required treaties, and filed the required reports, and did everything that a cooperative, Category 3 species was supposed to do. 60 years ago, a woman named Dr. Claire Bennett had written a paper that was largely ignored by the galactic community, because it came from a primitive species, and was therefore not subject to serious consideration. The paper was about what she called adaptive conflict doctrine, which is a complicated way of saying that, if you are smaller than your enemy, you do not fight the way they fight. You fight the way they do not expect. Dr. Bennett had died 40 years ago, but her ideas had not. The fleet I was shown in those 2 hours was not large by galactic standards. It was never going to win a direct confrontation against the Vreth in open space. The Vreth had better shields. Their weapons had longer range. Their ships were faster in a straight line, and their armor was thicker. And their targeting systems were more sophisticated. Every single conventional metric said that humanity could not win a war against the Vreth Empire. The man with no insignia pulled up the tactical display and pointed to small markers spread across a wide region of space. "We are not going to fight them the way they fight," he said. "We are going to fight them the way nobody fights." The display shifted. It showed attack vectors, timing sequences, and something that I did not initially recognize until he explained it. Every major galactic power had deposited their complete military history in the Galactic Archive as part of a peace and transparency initiative that had been signed 40 years ago. The idea was that if everyone could see how every conflict had ever been fought, it would discourage aggression. What nobody had considered was that a Category 3 species with access to an academic exchange program would spend 30 years quietly reading every single file in that archive, every battle, every failed strategy, every approach that had been tried and had not worked, every weakness that had ever been exposed. Every pattern that repeated across species after species after conflict after conflict. We had read all of it. We had studied it. We had built models from it. And we had used all of that accumulated knowledge to design a method of engagement that had never appeared in the archive. Because we had invented it ourselves. From the gaps in everything else. The Vreth have 43 successful acquisitions, the man said. In every single one, the target species either surrendered immediately or attempted a conventional military response that the Vreth outmatched within 70 hours. Not once in 43 acquisitions has any species done what we are going to do. Witches, I said. Make it expensive, Grace Okafor said. Make it take a long time. Make it embarrassing. Make it cost them more than it's worth and make sure the galaxy is watching every moment of it. The plan had a name, Operation Boomerang. It was not a complex name, but it was an honest one. The core of it was 70 autonomous drone clusters, each one small enough to evade standard Vreth long-range detection. Each one loaded with a targeting suite built from 3 decades of archived, galactic tactical data. They moved in patterns that no Vreth defensive algorithm had ever been trained on, because those patterns did not come from any known military tradition. They came from human history, from ancient asymmetric warfare, from guerrilla tactics developed on Earth.